"I had 3 children in Hollywood," says 4-year-old Ryan, while pointing to a still from an old film, recognizing himself. The details he recalls? Strikingly accurate, and matching the life of a man who died years before Ryan was born. Another child, just 3 years old, knows the names of people in a village he has never visited, and describes its streets turn by turn. One begins speaking a language they've never heard in their entire life, fluently and without instruction. And yet another says, "In my previous life, I was shot in the chest." A birthmark sits precisely where he described the bullet wound, eerily resembling an entry point. Some people even recount their past lives, while under hypnosis. Are these just coincidences? The playful fabrications of a child's imagination? Or, is it possible that death isn't the end? At the University of Virginia, the Division of Perceptual Studies has been investigating these questions for over half a century. Dr. Ian Stevenson and his successor, Dr. Jim Tucker, have compiled over 2,500 cases from around the world, many involving children whose statements about violent deaths were later matched with autopsy reports and historical records. So now we ask, can this body of data offer a scientific answer to one of humanity's oldest and most haunting questions? Is reincarnation truly possible? When it comes to the scientific investigation of reincarnation claims, one name stands out above all: Dr. Ian Stevenson. In the second half of the 20th century, while serving as a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, Stevenson dedicated a significant portion of his life to researching cases of children who claimed to remember past lives. Beginning in the 1960s, he reportedly collected over 3,000 cases from diverse regions including India, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Turkey, and the United States. What all these children had in common was this: from a very young age, often as early as 2 or 3, they claimed to have memories from a previous life. And these weren't just rare anecdotes. Within the archives of the University of Virginia, there are more than 2,500 well-documented case files gathered from around the world. In the cases Stevenson examined, children, typically between the ages of 2 and 5, suddenly began speaking as if they had lived another life. They described cities they had never visited in vivid detail. They spoke of families they had never met. They recalled names, places, and events, often with striking accuracy. Some even described how they died in their previous lives. For instance, one child might say, "I was shot in the chest," while another might claim, "I died in a car crash." To investigate these claims, Stevenson and his team conducted meticulous fieldwork, following up on each lead. They searched public records to see if someone matching the child's description had actually existed, someone who had died in the way described. If the case seemed viable, they pursued autopsy reports, vital records, newspaper archives, police reports, and witness testimonies. The goal was clear: to determine whether the child's story matched a real person's life, in all its details. One of Stevenson's most striking findings involved children who had birthmarks or physical anomalies that corresponded with wounds or injuries from the life they claimed to have lived before. For example, in a case from India, a young boy claimed to have been shot in the chest in his previous life. Remarkably, he had 2 birthmarks, one on his chest and one on his back, mimicking a bullet entry and exit wound. Stevenson systematically documented such physical correlations and published his findings in a 2-volume work titled Reincarnation and Biology: A Contribution to the Etiology of Birthmarks and Birth Defects, 1997. In this extensive study, he reported that approximately 30 to 35% of the children he examined had meaningful birthmarks or deformities that closely matched fatal wounds described in their accounts. In many cases, the location and shape of these marks corresponded to documented causes of death. Even more astonishing, in at least 40 cases, there were medical records confirming the injuries of the deceased person the child claimed to have been. If these correlations are real, they suggest the possibility of a biological transfer mechanism between lives, a concept that would be revolutionary for science. Another curious phenomenon Stevenson encountered was called xenoglossy, the ability of a person to speak a language they have never learned. In a few rare cases, Stevenson documented children who spontaneously began speaking languages they claimed to have used in past lives. One case involved a boy from Burma, whose native language was Burmese, yet he began using words from Tamil, despite having never been exposed to it. In another case, an American woman reportedly spoke a Swedish dialect under hypnosis, despite having no prior exposure to the language. Xenoglossy cases are rare and difficult to analyze linguistically. Even Stevenson presented these findings with caution, not as proof, but as anomalies worthy of further study. Still, the idea that a person might speak a foreign language they've never learned remains one of the most unsettling and powerful arguments in favor of reincarnation. Dr. Ian Stevenson's decades of research sparked immense curiosity within the scientific community, but also ignited heated debates. On one hand, he was praised for bringing rigorous fieldwork to a subject often dismissed. On the other hand, his methods and interpretations were heavily scrutinized. Importantly, Stevenson never claimed to have proven reincarnation. He consistently referred to his subjects as cases suggestive of reincarnation or reincarnation-type cases. Even with the strongest examples, he would only go so far as to say that reincarnation was the best, but not the only, possible explanation. Nonetheless, critics argued that Stevenson occasionally forced conclusions or, at the very least, operated under unconscious bias. They suggested that children's statements might have been influenced, consciously or not, by their families or communities. After all, it's well known that young children are highly susceptible to adult suggestion and expectation. A child might internalize a story they heard and retell it as if it were their own. Or they might craft a narrative to please their parents, especially if it garners attention or approval. Stevenson was aware of this risk. That's why he tried to record cases as early as possible, before outside influence could distort the child's memories. Even so, some criticisms focused on the time lag between a person's death and the investigation. Memories fade. Stories change. The telephone effect, where details get altered over time, was a valid concern in many cases. Another point of contention was that most of Stevenson's cases came from cultures where belief in reincarnation is already widespread. Skeptical scientists argued that this may reflect cultural bias rather than a universal phenomenon. In their view, these cases might be better explained as socio-cultural constructs than actual evidence of life after death. While Stevenson's work rekindled scientific curiosity, it also raised serious questions about how evidence should be interpreted. One of the most balanced views came from renowned astrophysicist Carl Sagan. Though known for his strong scientific skepticism, Sagan argued that dismissing Stevenson's work outright would be a mistake. In his 1995 book, The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark, Sagan named reincarnation among the 3 most intriguing paranormal claims deserving scientific investigation. He referred to cases where young children gave details they seemingly couldn't have known, stating that while they remain dubious and inconclusive, they do have a degree of experimental support. Importantly, Sagan did not say he believed in reincarnation. He simply recognized that such claims can, and should, be tested through scientific means. Like many scientists, Sagan believed reincarnation hadn't been proven. But he also believed that labeling it impossible without serious inquiry was unscientific. His perspective encapsulates what science should be when facing extraordinary claims. Skeptical, but open-minded. Doubt, yes, but never the denial of the question. After Dr. Ian Stevenson retired and passed away in 2007, the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia continued his line of research. The person who took up the mantle was psychiatrist Dr. Jim Tucker, widely considered Stevenson's scientific successor. Beginning in the early 2000s, Dr. Tucker not only reanalyzed Stevenson's case files but also began collecting new cases himself. Focusing especially on examples from Western countries, Tucker set out to explore whether reincarnation claims were a cultural phenomenon unique to Asian societies, or a universal aspect of human experience. He adopted Stevenson's rigorous methodology but enhanced it using the tools of modern science and technology. For example, the thousands of handwritten case reports from Stevenson's era were digitized and structured into a searchable database, allowing Tucker to perform statistical analyses and identify common patterns across decades of data. Over time, the cases Dr. Tucker studied largely confirmed Stevenson's original findings. Analysis of over 2,500 coded cases revealed some striking consistencies. For instance, around 70% of the children said they had died in their previous lives in a sudden or violent manner. Even more interestingly, a significant portion of these deaths involved male individuals. Approximately 2/3 of the violent death cases were male, which closely mirrors real-world statistics, where men are more likely to die from sudden or violent causes. Another consistent pattern appeared in roughly 20% of cases. These children had birthmarks or bodily scars that aligned with the fatal injuries they described from their alleged past lives. It was as if their bodies carried a physical imprint of trauma from another existence. In approximately 20% of the cases, children also shared memories of an intermission between death and rebirth. Some said they had waited in God's house, while others described lingering near the place they died before entering the womb. Although these narratives were not always consistent, the mere fact that so many children described a post-death, pre-birth period led some researchers to believe these were more than just psychological fantasies or dreams. Furthermore, there appeared to be no significant correlation between the beliefs of the parents and the accuracy of the child's statements. In other words, strong cases were not limited to families who already believed in reincarnation. Similar claims were also documented in non-believing families, including those from Western Christian backgrounds. Indeed, Dr. Tucker has published many such cases, demonstrating that children who speak of past lives are not exclusive to Eastern cultures. One of the most well-known cases is that of Ryan Hammonds, a young boy from the United States. Around the age of 4, Ryan began persistently telling his parents about a previous life in Hollywood. He would refer to strangers in old photographs as "my family," and claim to remember scenes from classic films. One of the strangest things he said was, "I had 3 sons, but I can't remember their names." And he would often cry while saying it. At first, Ryan's mother dismissed this as innocent imagination. But as her son became more insistent, she decided to look deeper. She found books about classic Hollywood films, and they began reviewing them together. One day, Ryan suddenly pointed to an old movie still and exclaimed, "That's me." The man he pointed to was a background actor named Marty Martin, who had lived in 1940s Hollywood and had died long before Ryan was born. As the details Ryan gave were investigated, they were found to match Marty Martin's life with astonishing precision. For example, Ryan had said he had been a Hollywood agent, had lived in a luxury home, and had 3 children. All of these statements matched Martin's life. He had worked as an agent, lived in a Beverly Hills mansion with a pool, and had exactly 3 children. Even some of the details Ryan could not fully articulate were later confirmed. At one point, he said he remembered something like Rock Street. His parents didn't understand what this meant, until it was discovered that Marty Martin's daughter had married the actor Rock Hudson. Ryan may have been recalling that connection without being able to name it. Dr. Tucker studied Ryan's case in detail and fully documented it. This and similar cases, where specific and verifiable details are confirmed, entered the academic literature as examples where the probability of coincidence seemed vanishingly small. Of course, even the best documented cases might not be enough to convince mainstream science. But they challenge the idea that these children must be making things up. As Dr. Tucker has stated, if a child's statements so precisely match the life of a deceased person they never met, then calling it coincidence stretches the limits of reason. Dr. Jim Tucker's work, like Stevenson's, has garnered limited but consistent attention in the scientific community. While his research may not make headlines at major university conferences, many of his case studies have been published in reputable academic journals. Back in the 1970s, the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease even dedicated a special issue to Stevenson's work. The editor described him as a methodical, cautious, and precise researcher. Though critics continued to argue that the available data were insufficient to conclusively prove reincarnation. And today, the situation remains largely the same. Reincarnation research still occupies a niche in the academic landscape. Topics like parapsychology are often met with skepticism, or even stigma, within the scientific establishment. As a result, researchers like Stevenson and Dr have typically published their findings in specialized journals, rather than in the mainstream science literature. Still, institutions like DOPS at the University of Virginia continue this line of inquiry, logging new cases each year. Dr. Dr remains driven by scientific curiosity and open-minded skepticism, pursuing the question, can consciousness exist beyond bodily death? So, do these thousands of cases collected over decades constitute scientific proof that reincarnation is real? The majority of the scientific community still answers, no. No matter how intriguing or difficult to explain, these cases remain anecdotal observations, not results from controlled, repeatable laboratory experiments. Compelling personal stories may persuade the public, but for scientists, evidence must be observable, measurable, and reproducible by independent researchers. So far, reincarnation claims have not met that standard. As a result, no matter how fascinating the evidence may seem, these cases still fall short of what science considers proven. Indeed, since Stevenson's time, mainstream science has not accepted reincarnation as a verified phenomenon. When trying to understand reincarnation claims scientifically, as with any extraordinary claim, one must first consider the possibility of simpler, more earthly explanations. So, what might be the source of these childhood memories? Our knowledge in the field of psychology shows us that the human brain is not nearly as reliable as a camera recording device. For example, many of the memories we recall may actually be constructed after the fact, distorted, or enriched with information from other sources. One of the most frequently cited explanations in this context is the concept of cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia occurs when a person recalls information they had previously read or heard somewhere, but forgets the source, and thus re-experiences it as if it were their own original memory. A young child, without realizing it, may absorb stories told by relatives, scenes from television, or anecdotes from family elders, and later blend them together into a fabricated narrative of a past life. This is not a conscious process. Just as adults sometimes recall an idea they once read and mistake it as an original thought of their own, children may take a fairy tale they heard and believe it to be a fragment of their own past. For children with vivid imaginations, this kind of absorption and reconstruction is especially likely. Another possible psychological mechanism is confabulation. Confabulation is the tendency to fill gaps in memory with information we unknowingly invent, but which we accept as true. Children, developmentally, are particularly adept at filling uncertainties and creating meaningful stories. For example, a 4-year-old child might not understand why they feel an unexplained fear of a particular place. Their imagination could then supply a narrative, something terrible happened to me there. Over time, this story could solidify into what feels like a genuine memory. This mechanism is especially relevant in emotionally intense or traumatic past life claims, where children may be subconsciously trying to make sense of their own anxieties. The attitudes of parents, researchers, or the surrounding community can also shape children's statements. If a child receives significant attention and approval from parents when recounting unusual memories, they may unconsciously embellish the story to sustain that attention. Adults, even without realizing it, may ask leading questions that reinforce false memories in the child's mind. For example, in your past life, did you die in an earthquake? Such a question could implant an idea that never previously existed for the child. Even researchers like Stevenson and Dr, despite their efforts to remain objective, may have unintentionally shaped narratives through the way their questions were posed. That is why well-designed studies aim to let children recount their memories with minimal external influence. Skeptical researchers argue that all reincarnation cases can be explained through these psychological and socio-cultural mechanisms. For instance, psychologist Christopher French has suggested that false childhood memories and cognitive errors could account for the phenomenon. Philosopher Paul Edwards likewise argued that Stevenson's and Tucker's collections amounted to little more than anecdotal evidence, lacking scientific weight. Some skeptics have gone further, suggesting that certain cases presented as reincarnation may in fact be deliberate fabrications or exaggerations. And yet, interestingly, in the strongest cases studied, families rarely sought financial gain or fame. In fact, many were reluctant to share their children's strange stories at all, often trying to keep them hidden. Dr. Tucker has noted that in Western countries, many parents were hesitant to discuss such cases out of fear of negative reactions from their communities. Thus, fraud or attention-seeking appears to be a weak explanation for the majority of well-documented cases. Nevertheless, the questions remain. Could the child have heard the information elsewhere? Could details have been distorted over time? Could the family have unconsciously influenced the child's account? These possibilities must always remain on the table. Scientists cannot dismiss them outright. Still, some aspects of reincarnation cases do not align neatly with such ordinary explanations. For example, in dozens of cases documented by Dr. Tucker, parents began keeping written records of their children's statements from the very first utterances. This practice significantly reduced the likelihood of exaggeration or retrospective distortion. In some families, meticulous notes became a strong defense against the accusation that stories had been embellished over the years. Moreover, in many cases, the details children provided were so specific and highly unusual that cultural suggestion alone seemed insufficient. For instance, it is difficult to explain how a 4-year-old, living far from a certain town, could invent the name, family, and cause of death of a garage mechanic who died years earlier, unless there were some extraordinary process at play. Cases like these remain puzzling even for staunch skeptics. The well-known atheist author Sam Harris, after reviewing Stevenson's findings, remarked that either these cases were part of an elaborate, large-scale deception, or that something genuinely unusual was occurring. His words capture the essence of the scientific attitude. If an anomaly cannot be fully explained by fraud or error, then perhaps there is a real phenomenon behind it, at the very least, something worthy of serious investigation. The debate over reincarnation ultimately comes down to the nature of consciousness itself. From the perspective of modern neuroscience, consciousness is considered a product of the brain's complex physical and chemical processes. In this view, our personality, memories, and sense of self are entirely dependent on neural connections within the brain. When brain activity ceases, such as at death, this mainstream view holds that consciousness also ends. Indeed, countless studies to date have shown that our memories and personal identity are tied to specific regions of the brain, that damage to the brain can erase memories or alter personality. No brain, no mind has become something of a motto for contemporary science. If that is the case, then with the death of the body, mental functions must also end, making it impossible for memories and personality to transfer to another body. This is precisely the point emphasized by scientists who are skeptical of reincarnation. No known biological mechanism suggests that a person's experiences or learned knowledge could float free after death and reappear intact in another body. Memory traces are encoded in the complex networks of our neurons, and when those cells die, the information dies with them, at least, according to our current scientific understanding. And yet, we cannot claim to have solved every question about the nature of consciousness. The so-called hard problem of consciousness remains one of the most difficult puzzles in neuroscience and philosophy alike. Put simply, how do the brain's physiological processes give rise to subjective experience? From the interactions of billions of neurons, how does the sense of I emerge, the awareness of one's own existence, the ability to perceive colors, to feel pain, to savor joy? This transformation is something science has not yet fully illuminated. As a result, some researchers have advanced unconventional hypotheses about the origins of consciousness. Some suggest that consciousness is not merely a byproduct of the brain, but rather a fundamental feature of the universe itself. Viewed in this way, without falling into the trap of invoking quantum physics for every mystery, this perspective often takes the form of panpsychism or pantheistic philosophies. If consciousness is indeed a fundamental property woven into the very fabric of space and time, like electricity or gravity, then the brain might serve as a kind of receiver-transmitter. In that case, even if the brain dies, the signal of consciousness could continue to exist in the universe. This is, of course, a highly speculative idea, and one that lacks solid scientific support. Still, it has been taken seriously enough by certain physicists and philosophers to warrant discussion. For instance, interpretations of the observer's role in quantum mechanics seem to hint at consciousness influencing matter. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger once implied that the essence of matter itself is rooted in consciousness. More recently, Dr. Roger Penrose and Dr. Stuart Hameroff proposed the orchestra-OR theory, suggesting that consciousness may be linked to quantum processes in the brain. While these remain outside the scientific mainstream, researchers like Dr. Jim Tucker have looked to quantum theory for clues that might shed light on reincarnation. Tucker has argued that quantum physics suggests our physical world may in fact arise from consciousness, thus supporting the possibility that consciousness could exist independently of the brain. This is not a widely accepted view, but it represents wonder and curiosity. And as that seem impossible today were, until yesterday, nothing more than incomprehensible riddles. Whether the riddle of reincarnation is ever solved or not, our journey at the crossroads of science and mystery will continue to expand the boundaries of the human experience.